of a memorial garden and the unexpected burden of shared remembrance. 5 steps out of the punishment cell, and Crispin felt dislocated. The light hurt his eyes. The movement of tourists around the prison yard seemed frivolous, a pantomime disconnected from the connection with reality he felt. He couldn't look at Carrie directly. His eyes had seen something in that shared darkness, something new for which none of his dictionaries or lexicons had a word. "There's a boat to the Isle of the Dead in 10 minutes, he said instead, his voice sounding too formal, too much like his lecture hall self. "If you're interested, not that you need to be, of course. Perfectly fine if you'd prefer to explore on your own. Just thought I'd mention it. Island of Graves and all that."
"I am."
2 words, just 2. Yet in them he heard the same unmoored quality he felt in himself. He risked a glance. Her face was composed, but her eyes were still far away. Her camera hung forgotten at her side. He was intensely aware of the space between them as they walked towards the jetty, the sound of her footsteps beside his on the gravel path. It felt like a physical presence, a charged field he was afraid to breach. Like 2 opposing magnets held close, the air between them seemed to hum with invisible energy. The harbour sparkled deceptively in the midday light, the dark history of Port Arthur at odds with its picturesque setting. A small ferry bobbed at the wooden dock, where a cluster of tourists waited to board. Sharon was nowhere to be seen. This part of the tour was optional, led by a different guide. Crispin stepped aside to let Carrie board first, automatically extending his hand to steady her. She didn't take it, managing the small step herself. He felt a peculiar flicker of what? Rejection? Relief? He was disoriented, his usual confidence replaced by a maddening uncertainty. They found seats at the back of the boat, side by side on a wooden bench. Other tourists chattered around them, their holiday voices sounding thin and frivolous against the new, solid weight in his heart. He tried to see the harbour as Carrie might see it, not as a historical location with dates and facts attached, but as a composition. The way the light caught the ripples, the dark mass of the small island against the vast open water, the interplay of forest and ruin on the distant shore. The engine coughed to life and the ferry pulled away. The guide, a stocky woman with weather-beaten skin, began her spiel through a small megaphone. Crispin tuned her out. He knew the history. What he didn't know was this growing feeling in his being, the sense that all his knowledge was just a series of impeccably researched footnotes around a blank page. This was their final crossing, he said quietly to Carrie, his gaze fixed on the island growing larger ahead. For everyone who died here, the last journey they'd ever make. He heard her camera click. Turning, he watched her frame a shot, the way she crouched low, her focus absolute. She wasn't capturing the island as a whole, but a detail. The play of light where the water met the shore, the dark silhouettes of the Norfolk pines against the sky. He tried to see what she saw, to understand the instinct that guided her hand. The ferry bumped gently against the small jetty on the Isle of the Dead. They disembarked, following a gravel path that wound up from the shore. The island was small, perhaps a hectare in total, with a hill rising from one end. The air smelled of salt and damp earth.
The cemetery was divided according to the strict hierarchy of the settlement,
the guide explained.
The higher ground was reserved for the officers, civil staff, and their families. Their graves are marked with headstones. The lower slopes were for the convicts.
They followed her up to the higher ground, where ornate Victorian headstones clustered among the trees. Crispin's mind automatically supplied context. The regiment of a military officer, the age of a surgeon's wife who died in childbirth, the date of a commandant's young son taken by fever. Facts, dates, the safe territory of historical record. But he kept watching Carrie. She seemed less interested in the inscriptions and more in the texture of lichen on the stone, the stark angle of a broken cross against the sky. She moved with a deliberateness he recognized as a form of intense concentration. Her camera an extension of her eye, her focus shutting out the rest of the world. The tour moved to the lower slope, a wind-swept expanse of undulating grass with only a handful of visible markers. The contrast was stark, the carefully preserved memory of the free versus the systematic erasure of the bound.
Over 1,000 convicts are buried on this island.
The guide was saying.
Most in this section. Their graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, if at all. Those markers quickly rotted away in the Tasmanian weather. Today, we can only identify a handful of the convict graves.
Crispin felt a familiar intellectual frustration at the loss of records, the historian's lament for data erased. But when he glanced at Carrie, he saw something else in her face. As she gazed out over the field of unmarked graves, her posture straightened, her chin lifted slightly. She was a silent, defiant guard posted over the memory of the nameless dead. The group clustered around one of the few restored convict headstones. Crispin found himself drifting towards the edge of the burial ground, Carrie beside him. They stood looking back towards the main settlement across the water, the prison building small but distinct in the distance. "It's the spaces in between," he said, the words coming to him unbidden. "That's what I'm starting to see. Not the official history, but all the human moments that went unrecorded. The quiet sufferings, the small kindnesses, the prayers whispered into darkness. God, listen to me. I sound like a bad historical novel."
You sound like a man beginning to see,
she replied, her eyes still on the distant shore. "You've always seen that, haven't you? It's what you look for with your camera."
I try to. Sometimes I succeed.
The wind gusted, whipping across the island with a low moan through the pines. Crispin saw Carrie shiver slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. That small human gesture, combined with the fierce empathy he'd seen in her eyes, broke through his academic reserve. He felt the sheer scale of the anonymous loss like a physical weight, stripping away his composure. These weren't just statistics. They were people. An instinct, not a thought, made him reach for her hand. His fingers laced through hers, a firm, anchoring pressure. He half expected her to pull away, to question the gesture or make some clever remark about presumption. For him, the touch was not a claim, but a confession. "I feel this too. Ground me." Her hand was warm, smaller than his, but strong. She didn't pull away. Instead, he felt an answering pressure, an acknowledgement. They stood like that, not speaking, as the wind pulled at their clothes and the grass whispered over 1,000 forgotten graves. The tour guide called from the path, gathering the group for the return journey. Still holding hands, they turned away from the view and walked back towards the jetty. The intimacy of the contact was both foreign and strangely familiar. It wasn't romance, this touch. It was an anchor in a storm of grief. It was a silent, shared treaty against the overwhelming tide of history. Their linked hands rested on the bench between them, visible to anyone who cared to look, though no one seemed to notice or care. Crispin found himself oddly disinterested in what others might think. The opinions of strangers, of colleagues of his social circle, concerns that had governed so much of his life, seemed suddenly trivial. What mattered was the warm pressure of her fingers entwined with his, the silent communication passing between them. As the ferry approached the main dock, she gently withdrew her hand. The public space reasserted itself, creating a necessary distance. But something had been acknowledged that couldn't be unacknowledged. He felt its absence as a phantom warmth against his palm.
I think Sharon's gathering everyone over there.
Carrie said, nodding towards the visitor centre.
We should probably rejoin the main group.
Of course. Right. Yes, the main group. Good idea. Not that staying here wouldn't be... the ruins are fascinating, but Yes, Sharon. Group. Absolutely. They walked together across the grounds, rejoining the ship's tour group where Sharon waited near a garden of reflective pools. Crispin assumed this was just another part of the historic site, perhaps the foundations of a former building. But as Sharon began to speak, her professional tour guide demeanour fell away, replaced by something deeply solemn.
Before we return to the bus,
She said, her voice quieter than it had been all day.
I want to bring you to this memorial garden. This is the site of the former Broad Arrow Cafe, where most of the victims of the 1996 Port Arthur massacre lost their lives.
The date slammed into Crispin, 1996. His mind, trained to categorize and contextualize, fumbled. Peterloo? Amritsar? The comparisons were useless, absurd. This wasn't history he could analyze from a safe distance. He reached for his usual tools, chronology, context, political fallout, and found them useless, like trying to catalogue a scream. He had been at Oxford, working on his second book. He remembered the news reports, a tragic story from the other side of the world. Now he was standing on the ground where it had happened.
On Sunday, the 28th of April 1996,
Sharon continued.
a lone gunman killed 35 people and injured 23 others at this site. The victims were tourists, staff, locals enjoying a Sunday lunch. The youngest was just 3 years old.
He stared at the peaceful garden, the water, the single cross, the preserved walls, and his historian's toolkit shattered. The dates, the names, the causes. They were all meaningless intellectual factors in the face of this raw immediacy.
The memorial garden was created as a place of reflection and remembrance.
Sharon said.
The cross above the ruins marks the spot where many lives were lost. The pool reflects the sky, a symbol of peace and hope.
He looked from the garden to the ancient prison buildings beyond, centuries of suffering suddenly collapsing into a single unbearable weight. The cruelty of the penal system, the mass graves on the island, the gunshots echoing through this cafe less than 30 years ago. Different times, different causes, the same human capacity for inflicting pain. He felt Carrie shift beside him and knew without looking that she felt it too, this layered sorrow, the grief of one century bleeding into the next. The connection between them, forged in darkness and strengthened on the island of the dead, seemed to expand to encompass this new grief. Sharon let a long moment of silence pass before speaking one final time.
Never forget what happened here.
The words landed on Crispin not as a historical imperative, but as a deeply personal burden. To remember was not just an academic exercise, it was a moral obligation. To witness, to feel, to carry forward the truth of human suffering, both historical and immediate. It was a weight he now shared with the woman standing silently beside him, her camera hanging unused at her side, her eyes fixed on the memorial cross.